Well, thanks a lot for inviting me to talk, and great to see some people signed in. So my name's Tom Moore. I'm a lecturer in planning at the University of Liverpool. And for probably around the last 10 years or so, I've been doing research on community-led housing. It's been a really interesting period, I think, to kind of track the kind of growth of the sector, the emergence of the different community-led housing hubs in different areas. I think what's really interesting about this session today is trying to talk about and think about different and perhaps creative ways in which community-led housing can be funded and expanded and furthered. So today, in this presentation, I'm going to keep it pretty brief, and it's going to be a very general kind of overview of some of the key partnerships and collaborations that can help community-led housing groups gain access to funding and resources. So I'm just going to, in this presentation, just give a couple of slides, which gives an overview of some of those key partnerships and some of the opportunities. And hopefully in the breakout rooms, we'll kind of further that and explore maybe some of the kind of perceptions and experiences and local opportunities that exist for partnership and collaboration. So I'm going to keep it pretty general. There's not too many case studies in the presentation, but obviously happy to kind of discuss them and talk about them in the breakout room. And I'm sure Andy and Josh as well, from their experience as well in Leeds, can definitely feed into that as well. I think briefly, it's just worth thinking about why partnerships are important. So I guess when we're thinking about partnerships, I'm talking about community-led housing groups striking up some relationships with other actors, other stakeholders in the kind of housing and development world. And why might we think partnerships are important? Well, obviously community-led housing doesn't kind of develop and progress in a bubble, and there's various networks and relationships that are needed to develop housing schemes. Particularly important in regards to thinking about access to land. So there might be a partnership with landowners, whether they be public or private landowners or individuals or organisations. Partnerships might be quite important in trying to access and identify land for development. There's access to capital and funding, which is obviously one of the main things we're talking about today, whether that be public funding through grants, private funding or funding through charitable and third sector sources as well. Clearly, the kind of context we're operating in, the kind of opportunities for grant funding seems to be constraining slightly. So I think this session today is going to be quite interesting to kind of explore and think about how we as a community-led housing sector can kind of, configure kind of alternative solutions. And I think it's worth saying as well, why are partnerships important for kind of community-led housing schemes, but also I guess for thinking about how we deliver and develop housing more generally. I think they can be mutually beneficial for both communities, community-led housing groups, and developers, whether they be housing associations or private developers, trying to kind of bring to the fore and capitalise on the different benefits that each can bring to a scheme, the different attributes that those different actors can bring to a scheme. If we think about a community group with kind of deep-rooted local knowledge and commitment to meeting local needs and local priorities, combining that with the development expertise of a housing association or a private developer, that can be potentially mutually advantageous. So I'm really going to talk briefly. I'm going to skirt over the bit about housing associations a little bit, because I think the kind of more interesting angle for this is obviously the kind of identifying maybe other alternative sources of funding. But I do think it's worth briefly kind of mentioning that housing associations have been and probably do continue to be a key partner for community-led housing groups. So over the last few years, housing associations have supported many community-led housing groups with access to grant funding through Homes England funding programmes, often helping groups with applications for grants and the management of those grants. Housing associations are also known as registered providers. To obtain funding through Homes England, you have to be a registered provider, which many community-led housing groups don't want to do, although they are capable and eligible to do so if they wish. So housing associations have been important partners in kind of configuring that access to grant funding. They've also been key partners in bringing development expertise, stuff to do with progressing a development, land and site acquisition, liaising with different partners such as architects and construction firms, etc. And generally maybe de-risking schemes for community-led housing groups, reducing some of the demands that are placed on community-led housing groups, which are often obviously sometimes composed of volunteers as well. So housing associations have made kind of a contribution to the progressing community-led housing schemes. Then there's kind of the private developers as well, who can support community-led housing groups with access to land and different development opportunities. A particular angle, I think, or an opportunity for community-led housing might be through what's known as Section 106 agreements, which is essentially private developers often have to provide a proportion of their homes of their new developments as affordable housing through a Section 106 agreement. And this might offer an opportunity for some community-led housing groups. If they strike a relationship with a developer, the community-led housing group could potentially fulfill that kind of obligation that the developer has to provide that percentage of affordable homes on a new development. So that might offer one opportunity for which community-led housing groups could perhaps strike almost like an unlikely but mutually beneficial partner with a private developer. It might provide them with access to land, access to a site within a bigger development. But even if that were not possible, then one kind of approach may also be to seek funding through what is known as commuted sums. So if a developer doesn't fulfill its Section 106 obligation through providing a percentage of homes on a new development, it can also pay what's known as a commuted sum to a local authority in lieu of providing the homes. And there have been some examples around the country. I think there's a community land trust in Lincolnshire, and I think in South Hams in Devon as well, where local authorities have provided community-led housing groups with those commuted sums to support their development. So they've kind of redirected that resource and reinvested it into the community-led housing sector. So that might provide one opportunity for accessing capital. And I do know that Andy and Josh are going to talk about how you might speak to local authorities about funding. So maybe that might be something they pick up on as well. But I think also it's worth thinking about, I do realise there's people in this room who are at different stages with their community-led housing schemes. Some maybe very early in the process, some maybe further down the line. But I think even at an early stage, it's worth thinking about what kind of the unique selling points of community-led housing are, and what that can actually offer developers, and kind of developing a bit of a narrative around that. So community-led housing has significant amounts and significant potential to offer the housing sector in general. It offers enhanced community input and influence over and in the planning and design of schemes. A good example, and a very well-known example, is on the St Clement's site in East London. That's where a disused hospital was developed by Galliford, a private developer, but with a portion of homes allocated to a community land trust, which was then obviously allocated to local residents. And there was significant community input and influence in that scheme. The CLT was regularly meeting with the architect and held community design workshops regularly to ensure that kind of communities and local people had a significant input and influence over kind of the look and the feel and the design of the housing development. And we know that's also obviously particularly important, particularly when new developments are proposed in communities. Communities often want some assurance or reassurance as to whether and how developments will bring local benefit. And by community-led housing being part of a private development, by being part of a broader development, a broader scheme, that's advantageous to developers. The involvement of community-led housing group, their commitment and a deep-rooted local commitment and local knowledge bringing that to a private developer helps a developer to make a compelling case about how they're engaging with communities and how they're taking kind of local preferences and needs into account in their development. I talked on the previous slide about the fulfilment of Section 106 obligations with respect to affordable housing provision and community benefit. I won't reiterate that, but I do think that's a real opportunity for community-led housing groups and the community-led housing sector, and maybe one that we might talk about in the breakout rooms. And I think just generally, community-led housing is about planning and delivering homes, for people and by people, for local people and by local people. It offers a really people-led, people-powered way of planning, delivering and allocating housing to ensure it brings community benefit and local benefits. And I think that, as a sector, making that narrative and putting that forward to private developers can be maybe particularly compelling and may help unlock and lead to some kind of access to resource and capital. So I'll wrap it up there. That's a very kind of broad overview of maybe what partnerships are, why they might be kind of mutual, what they might look like, who partnerships might be with, and why they might be mutually advantageous. I've put some bullet points up here, which we might explore in the breakout rooms. Happy to answer any questions as well in the breakout rooms, and I'll share these bullet points again when we do breakout. I'll stop there. Thanks very much, and I'll stop sharing my screen now.
Yes, Tom. That's excellent, really interesting, and some really some lots of stuff to look at. Particularly the commuted sums is a really, that's an interesting area. I think people will probably pick up on that. Okay, so now we have Andy Lloyd and Josh Lawson from Leeds Community Homes, who are going to talk about community and individual funding.
Right, I'll just get a screen share started. People see that?
Yep.
Fabulous. Just to give you a quick introduction, me and Andy both work as community-led housing advisors for Leeds Community Homes. We're one of the hubs that have sprung up over the last few years that have been supporting the community-led housing sector. Me and Andy do kind of varying amounts of, different forms of group support with the groups that we're engaged with. And one of the things that we've been working with groups recently is around funding and thinking about how they can access the funding they need to help develop their projects. We've been working with a lot of groups that either access startup funding, which was a previous grant that was available for startup costs, and then other groups that are coming through that have missed the deadline for that. So this is kind of something we've been thinking quite a lot about and we have some experience with. So this presentation will be quite whistle stop. We've got a few examples and things, but we can definitely go into more detail in the breakout room. But Andy's going to get us started.
Thanks, Josh. Hi, everybody. Okay, so a bit of an overview first. First comment is that if you're looking at a project that's involving rented homes, which a lot of projects obviously do, if you think about the average amount of grant that goes into a community-led housing scheme, which could be in the region of £50,000 per unit, it means that a government grant, housing grant, is always going to probably be an essential part of a scheme involving rented housing. Because that's a lot of money to find from other sources, but other sources can definitely help viability. So if you did actually raise a certain amount of money through something like a community share issue, it means that you're reducing the amount of long-term loan that's associated with the project, and that's going to help viability. And then the two big challenges really since the loss of the Community Housing Fund is startup funding for new groups to provide essential training as done by the hubs and so on, and startup costs like incorporation, and the initial investigations for de-risking sites. So there's actually quite a bit of work that needs to be done straight away when you start to look at a site before you commit to it. That needs to be funded. Now, there are funds like VentureSum around who can provide some of the later pre-development costs, but you have to get to that point first. So that's a gap in the current funding, which it may be that the Community Housing Fund does come back, in which case those areas of work would both be covered in the same way that they were before. Thanks, Josh. So these are some of the alternatives that we're going to have a look at. And I think actually it would have been worth putting in housing associations into this list, because when it comes to pre-development costs, depending on the kind of partnership that you go into with a housing association, it could be that the housing association is actually going to fund the scheme in its entirety, and that would therefore solve the issue of pre-development costs. But of course, if you wanted to kind of do a hybrid where you wanted to actually set the scene with your own investigations and design work, you would need to find some funding to cover that first. So we'll be looking at local authorities, community shares. Josh might say something about loan stock, because that's his area of expertise, crowdfunding and the other 2 points. Thanks, Josh. So just on the question of local authorities, obviously some of them did get Community Housing Fund because there were 2 iterations. The first one came as a surprise to local authorities, and it just arrived in their bank accounts. And quite a few of those local authorities still have money that's unspent. But even prior to that, local authorities were helping with setup costs for community housing projects and pre-development costs. So it's definitely a discussion that could be worth having with your local authority. And also local authorities can borrow at preferential rates. And so if they were willing to, they could pass that facility on to community housing projects. So therefore reducing interest rates on loans and so on. Over to you, Josh.
Yeah. So I'm just going to give a quick overview about community share things. Community shares, sort of in the last 10 years, have invested over 100 million into lots of different community business around the UK. They're not entirely around housing, a lot of them around community pubs and development trusts and other things like that. But there are a number of housing projects that have successfully used community shares as a form of financing. Beyond sort of the first question, well, the big impact around the kind of financing effect of it, it's also a really excellent mechanism in terms of generating community buy-in, empowering members to be involved in the decision-making power of the society and things like that. So community shares sort of have a broader impact on the governance of an organisation, as well as sort of a means for raising finance. So it can be kind of a dual pronged approach. It's only available to community benefit societies, so operates through a form of share capital that's only applicable to them. So for groups that are considering, particularly in early stage, that they might want to utilize community shares, or they may need to as a financing option, it has important implications for things like incorporation and how governance may work and things like that. Money that's raised from community shares is usually invested into capital costs. That makes the investment more sound. It provides kind of confidence to people that it's being invested in a residual asset should anything go wrong. There's quite a lot of work that goes into community share stuff. So you need a really sound business plan. You want to be mapping what target you're trying to aim for, why you want that target, what your lower aim is, what your higher aim is. Sort of producing a prospectus and other resources that go around with it it's quite a large component of work. It's also worth considering with community shares what the financial capacity of your local community is. So it might be that you want to build a big scheme and you're looking at finances several £1 million. It might be that you could raise community equity to that amount, but that is likely to be unrealistic. And in some communities, particularly more deprived areas that are trying to bring in community-led housing schemes, it might be that you need to widen your definition of what your local community is so that you can reach essentially a wider target audience that might be able to feed into the scheme. In terms of support around community shares, there's loads of resources out there that are really effective. The way that community shares typically work is there is an authentication method called the standard mark. So it goes through the community shares unit, which sits within Co-ops UK, and they kind of check it over to make sure that all of the information in it is clear and effective, and there are rules that regulate how share issues are issued. But it's considered very much best practice to be accessing those, and as a kind of confidence booster for people. There are many resources online. There's online step-by-step guides. There's a community shares handbook. There are licensed practitioners that can help the development of community share issues. There's funding available to pay for their time, and also Power to Change offers a booster scheme, which essentially provides match equity funding into successful community share issues. So tried and tested method, a lot of work, potentially quite a bit of work to get to the point where you're ready to do them, but they have a great track history, and there's a lot of support out there. Andy's going to quickly talk about an example that he's been involved with.
Yeah, so it's an interesting one. Keswick Community Housing Trust, they set up as a community benefit society, which was also registered as an exempt charity. So they had the benefits of being recognisable as a charity, but also being able to do community share issues. And they set out, they thought, well, Keswick's quite a wealthy place, even though it's a low wage economy, we'll be able to raise some money towards the cost of buying the land, which they were negotiating with the diocese. It was church land. And they thought, well, let's set a target of £100,000. But because they were in negotiations with Cumberland Building Society for the development loan and long-term loan, the Building Society quite sensibly advised them to set a slightly more circumspect target of £50,000, because essentially, if they didn't raise either the whole amount or enough of the money through the share issue, the business plan would have a hole. And that turned out to be very good advice. They did raise the £50,000 and a bit more afterwards. So they were then able to lever in the Cumberland development loan and proceed. And since then, they've gone on and done several more schemes.
And I'll just briefly mention one that Leeds Community Hub has been supporting recently. So Calder Valley CLT, they've done a kind of 2-property scheme with a community centre around preserving a heritage building in the area. It's very recently just finished, and they've hit their target. They had booster scheme support from Power to Change, so they had some match equity that was provided in there. So the table at the bottom shows that, like, they were able to leverage an additional £50,000 into their share offer. And yeah, that breakdown of the composition of the funding is kind of a demonstration about the point myself and Andy made earlier around, like, the funding mix that's likely to be required for a scheme. So they've poured in some grant funding. There's some Homes England grant in there, but they've also managed to raise pretty much half the money through their community share issue and the booster program. So it has provided a really big boost for the viability of the scheme, and means that the properties they've been able to bring in are going to be able to be genuinely affordable, low rent, and they can do kind of all kinds of renovation work that needs doing on them. Just moving on, we talk about crowdfunding. So maybe community shares can be referred to as a form of crowdfunding, and they are, because they're kind of leveraging community finance. Crowdfunding can be somewhat distinguished in terms of being more of like a donation-based model, usually in response for sort of rewards or perks, or it's like people are happy to chip some money into something. Can be much more effective for accessing early stage funding. Community shares require kind of a certain amount of diligence and progress in a project to be prepared for doing that. So crowdfunding can basically be the proto share kind of work. So it is still important to have a robust business plan and to be able to provide a compelling story to make sure that people are willing to invest into the scheme. But if you were to start out with a crowdfunder like this, that brings in the initial sort of seed money you need to develop the scheme, maybe to be ready for a bigger share issue. And it's also a really good opportunity to do some early community outreach and engagement, so that when it comes to doing the share issue, you've already laid the foundations for that kind of thing. Lots of resources available online for this. There's in particular a guide from Nesta and the Community Shares company around community crowdfunding. So that covers community shares as well. And there's links to that embedded in this that will be shared around. So highly recommended. Recommended platforms are listed there as well. FX in particular is a kind of ethical community crowdfunding website is really effective. And yeah, using crowdfunding, early crowdfunding as a means to apply for other finances, develop the scheme can be really, really useful, particularly in the absence of potentially other available funding. Like, people can invest in an idea quite early on before the development work has been done, which maybe your local authority or other funders will require more evidence for. Andy, do you want to take over?
Yeah, so this is interesting because I didn't have very much knowledge about angel investors, but looking into it, you'd think, well, these are the sort of people that are looking for massive returns and wouldn't necessarily be interested in social purpose and so on. But that they are interested in, you know, the kinds of things that you'd expect in terms of a sound proposition and a team that seems to know what they're doing. But they can bring experience and networks and time input potentially. But it was interesting, if we go on to the next slide, there are organizations that channel sort of socially minded angel investors, Resonance being one and Unlimited being another. And in the case of Resonance, they've actually found investment to contribute to part of the cost of a community land trust housing project. So there are definitely ways in which that kind of investment might be levered in. And I think the message here is to try to go through an organization that's already in touch with investors. So yeah, again, this is something which requires really good messaging, and it's all about the kind of sensible things that you would need to do anyway. You know, to have material to hand which explains what you're trying to do, what you're up against, the reasons behind it, and what you need in order to move forwards, which is the kind of material that you need anyway for local authorities or whoever you're working with. Thanks, Josh. And of course, philanthropy is, you know, that's where the housing association movement has its roots, I guess. It's, you know, almshouses and so on. And, you know, all these mechanisms which are set up in order to, so that people with some money could help people with less money. And there is an example, I just happen to know about this one, there are probably others, but the Glendale Gateway Trust in Northumberland, they actually, this was a bond that they issued out in the community, and one particular person lent that amount of money to the trust for a particular project. So interesting examples, really.
Yeah, so just as a quick closing summary, the options for community and individual finance can provide a really important and excellent resource for community-led housing. There's a proven track record around this thing now. There's numerous successful projects and also schemes that have done initial share issues, set up schemes, and then continued to do more developments, and that sort of built off the community engagement aspect that they've done with that. So it's no longer a kind of like potentially niche thing. It's quite a well-resourced and well-understood element to be included in a thing. And kind of the big thing to say at the moment is the gaps in the current funding resource. So the lack of startup funding for groups, the lack of pre-development funding that's available there, is that really these sources of funding need to be considered. So it's not really the ethic behind something like a community benefit society that you are being that solely because you need to do a share issue and raise finance through that mechanism. It's the community benefit society should be built around trying to connect the community and invest in an asset and all of this kind of thing. But if you're thinking about different ways that you might deliver your scheme and a community benefit society fits into that, then it's kind of like, if you're willing to move for that, then the option of being able to do a community share issue is yeah, something that kind of has to be considered in terms of just thinking about how to develop a stage through to the point where you might be able to access further funding. And I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Andy. Thanks, Josh.